If I had known that a simple purchase of Halloween decorations would change my life forever, maybe I would have chosen something different. It wasn't just a feeling of dread. What happened after that morning turned my world upside down. Looking back, it's terrifying to think about how such an ordinary decision led me into what felt like a nightmare I couldn't escape. But back then, I didn't know. I just wanted to impress Tyler. And that's how it all began. I'm Ashley, and this was the first time Tyler and I had decided to move in together. We were living in Portland, Oregon, and fall had just begun. I've always loved this time of year, especially Halloween. It was the perfect excuse to fill the house with pumpkins, lights, and skulls. Tyler was at work, so I decided it would be a surprise for when he came home. What could be more romantic than turning our home into a true Halloween scene? The house was quiet, except for the wind outside. I was on the couch with my laptop, browsing online stores for decorations. It wasn't my first attempt. I'd already visited several sites, but nothing seemed to catch my eye. The options were either too expensive or too basic. I wanted something that stood out, something that would truly bring the house to life. With each passing minute, my desire to find something special grew. That's when I saw the offer. A container full of Halloween decorations for just $20. It seemed too good to be true, but the temptation of getting so much for such a low price was irresistible. I clicked on the ad, my heart racing with excitement. Derek, the seller, had a rather odd profile, with poorly taken photos and random products ranging from women's clothing to used electronics. But honestly, I didn't care much. The price was too good to think twice. I sent Derek a message, and he replied quickly. We arranged for me to pick up the decorations that afternoon, and I couldn't wait to have everything ready before Tyler got home. I closed the laptop, satisfied with my choice. In my mind, the house was already lit up with pumpkins and cobwebs, a perfect vision. If only I had known what was coming, I would have done anything to avoid that container. Around lunchtime, I decided to review my message to Derek just to make sure everything was in order. He had responded so quickly, which reassured me in a way. A container of decorations seemed like a real steal for just $20. Despite the seller's odd profile, I convinced myself it was just someone trying to get rid of old junk. After all, who would sell that many Halloween items for such a ridiculously low price? Something about the simplicity of the offer piqued my curiosity, but I didn't want to overthink it. I still felt a little uneasy about Derek's profile. His photos had nothing to do with decorations. They were of women's clothes, old appliances, and some items that looked more like junk than anything else. But at the same time, I figured he was just trying to sell things other people would throw away. And why not take advantage of this opportunity? It would be the perfect way to save money and create the Halloween setup of my dreams. My excitement outweighed my doubts. In the afternoon, I confirmed with Megan, my best friend, if she could come with me to pick up the decorations. She thought the whole thing was strange, of course, but she agreed to join me. Megan has always been more cautious than I am, but even she laughed at the idea of buying a whole container for such a low price. You're going to end up with a pile of junk, Ash, she said, laughing. I joked back, but deep down her comment stuck with me. What if it really was just junk? Maybe it was, but I couldn't shake the excitement. As the time to meet Derek approached, I started to feel a slight discomfort in my stomach, a mix of anxiety and excitement. Still, I decided to ignore it. Tyler was at work, and with luck, he'd come home to find the house fully decorated. It wasn't long before Megan and I would go pick up the container, and I was already making mental plans for where I'd put each item. My mind couldn't stop imagining how everything would look. Maybe that weird feeling I had was just from anticipation. When Derek sent me the location to pick up the container, my stomach turned a little. The address was in a remote part of the city, in a neighborhood I knew wasn't the safest. But Megan would be with me, and I just needed to grab the decorations and leave. I decided not to think too much about the place. After all, it seemed simple enough. I'd pay the $20, pick up the boxes, and be on my way. That's it. Megan and I got in the car in the late afternoon. The daylight was starting to fade, which only added to the eerie feeling I'd had since the beginning of this idea. As we drove, Megan commented on how strange it was that Derek was selling so many things for such a low price. I agreed, but tried to focus on the decorations I was hoping to find. In my head, it was still all part of a great deal. It'll be quick, I kept repeating to myself. as if that would ease the growing discomfort as we got closer. As we moved farther from the city center, the surroundings began to change. The houses looked older, some clearly abandoned. Few streetlights were on, and the ones that worked cast a dim, yellowish glow, adding to the decaying atmosphere. Megan looked out the window, silent, and I could tell she was as uncomfortable as I was. "Are you sure this is the right place?" she asked. I checked the GPS and nodded, even though I wasn't entirely sure we should be there. We arrived at the address Derek had given me. The house looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were dusty and covered in cobwebs, and the curtains, faded, swayed with the wind, as if something or someone was lightly pushing them. There were no cars in the driveway, no signs of life. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Megan was clearly worried. "Are you sure he lives here?" she asked, eyeing the house with suspicion. Before I could answer, I noticed movement in the upstairs curtains. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me instinctively step back. I looked at Megan, who had clearly seen it too. She suggested we leave, but I hesitated. I didn't want to seem paranoid or miss out on the opportunity to decorate the house for such a low price. I took a deep breath and messaged Derek, letting him know we had arrived. The reply was immediate. "Come in, the door's unlocked," he wrote. I looked at Megan, who was now staring at me with pure skepticism. The feeling of unease grew even stronger inside me. What once seemed like an irresistible opportunity was now turning into a bizarre situation. But curiosity and the desire to grab the decorations made me ignore the instinct screaming at me to turn back. We were here. It was just a matter of getting in and out quickly. Little did I know that this step would mark the beginning of something I could never have imagined. Stepping into that house felt like crossing an invisible barrier. The smell was the first thing that hit us. It was a mix of mold, rotting wood, and something stronger, an odor that clung to the air, hard to identify. The atmosphere felt suffocating, as if time had stopped inside. The light was dim, filtered through thick, dirty curtains. Megan looked at me, clearly uncomfortable, but neither of us said anything. I kept telling myself we were just here to pick up the container and leave, but each second inside made my stomach churn. In the darkness, I heard a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like someone walking carefully. My heart raced, and for a moment I thought Megan had heard it too, but she didn't seem to notice. Derek, the seller, appeared at the back door, but not in the way I expected. He didn't fully step into the room. He stayed in the shadows, with half of his body obscured. "This way," he said in a low, raspy voice. A shiver ran down my spine, but I followed, trying not to show my growing fear. We walked silently through narrow, dark corridors. Each step felt heavier, as if the air was growing thicker. Derek walked ahead, always keeping a strange distance from us, and I couldn't see his face clearly. Megan whispered something about leaving, but I was torn between curiosity and the urgency to get out as quickly as possible. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. The silence in the house was unsettling, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional creak from the wooden floor. When we finally reached a room at the back of the house, Derek pointed to a large container against the wall. It looked different from the photos. It was old, rusted, and had strange marks along the side, as if it had been dragged repeatedly. He insisted we open it, but something in his tone made me suspicious. "Don't you want to see what's inside?" he asked, with a slight chuckle that made me even more uneasy. What had once seemed like a deal too good to be true now felt like a mistake. I glanced at Megan, and she gave me a look of pure apprehension. I asked Derek to open the container first, and he hesitated. His expression changed, growing more serious, almost irritated. "You're no fun," he muttered, with a tone that made me instinctively step back. My heart was racing, and I knew we were in a strange and possibly dangerous situation. I wanted to leave, but something held me back, a mix of fear and uncertainty that kept me frozen. Megan and I stood still, trying to figure out what to do next. The strong smell and the heavy air made everything more suffocating, and the house seemed to be closing in on us. Derek remained by the container, his posture tense, as if waiting for our reaction. Every passing second, made the situation stranger, and I could feel Megan growing more nervous. The oppressive environment was affecting us in ways I couldn't explain. It felt like something unseen was watching, waiting. I tried to force a smile, try to seem calmer than I really was. "I think we'd prefer if you opened the container, Derek," I said, attempting to sound casual. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes glinted in a way I couldn't interpret. Then, suddenly, he stepped forward and started to open the container. The sound of rusty hinges echoed through the room, amplifying the feeling of claustrophobia. The smell that came from the container was unbearable, a smell of decay that made us cover our noses and step back. Megan tugged on my arm, whispering that we should leave immediately. I knew she was right. The atmosphere had become intolerable, as if the house was pushing us to leave. But Derek didn't seem to care about our discomfort. He watched us as he held the container open, as if he was waiting for us to approach. The air was so heavy that it was hard to breathe. Everything around us seemed darker, and I knew something was very, very wrong here. Whatever was inside that container, I didn't want to find out. "Let's go," Megan whispered, and this time, I didn't hesitate. We started moving slowly toward the exit, trying not to draw Derek's attention. He remained by the container, his empty, unsettling eyes fixed on us. It seemed like he was enjoying our fear. Each step we took felt slower, as if the air around us was pulling us back. The smell of rot and Derek's gaze were all I could feel as we tried to escape. Finally, we reached the door that led to the main hallway. My heart was pounding so fast I could almost hear it. I looked back and saw that Derek was still there, watching us with that eerie, disturbing look. "You really don't want to see what's inside?" he asked, his voice loaded with something I couldn't quite place. We didn't answer. The only thing on my mind was getting out of that house as fast as possible. I didn't know what was inside the container, and at that moment, I didn't want to know. We reached the hallway, but the heavy air and nauseating smell seemed to follow us. Megan could barely speak, only pulling me toward the exit, her steps growing faster. The house seemed bigger and darker now, as if the shadows on the walls had stretched. We felt like we needed to leave as soon as possible. However, before we reached the door, we heard a harsh sound, like metal scraping against the floor. I looked back and saw Derek fully opening the container. The scene was quick, but enough to make me stop in my tracks. The smell that now filled the room was so strong it brought tears to my eyes. But despite the nausea, I couldn't look away from what was happening. Derek, with a disturbing smile on his lips, lifted the lid of the container and looked inside, as if he was assessing something. The air around us seemed frozen, and for a moment, complete silence took over the house. All we could hear was the sound of our own quick breaths and the faint creak of the wooden floor. "You really don't want to see?" he murmured, without taking his eyes off the container. Megan pulled me again, insisting we leave. I knew she was right. This wasn't a normal situation. Every instinct in me screamed to leave that house, but at the same time, something held me back. A morbid curiosity made me glance back one more time, hoping for a glimpse of what was inside the container. But before I could see anything, the stench grew stronger, almost choking me. The smell of decay overwhelmed my senses, forcing me to cover my nose and mouth. Whatever was in there, I didn't want to find out. Derek stepped back with a look of satisfaction that made me shudder. His eyes, glowing in the dim light, seemed to relish our panic. Megan practically dragged me toward the door, and this time I didn't resist. Every part of my body was on high alert. The air in the house seemed to press down on us, as if pulling us back inside. But what terrified me most was Derek's unnerving calm. There was no doubt that something awful was hidden in that container, and all I wanted now was to run. We finally managed to open the door and step outside. The relief was immediate, as if the air outside was lighter, easier to breathe. Megan and I ran to the car, not looking back. My heart was pounding out of control, and my mind was still trying to process what had just happened. Everything felt wrong. The house, Derek, and especially the container. Whatever was inside it, we didn't want to know. We were safe for now. We got in the car, and with trembling hands, I started the engine. Megan was in shock, her eyes wide and her breathing heavy. I knew I should say something, but my mind was blank. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was inside that container? The smell, Derek's look, it all felt like something out of a nightmare. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to shake those images from my mind, and sped away, wanted to get as far from that house as possible. As we drove away, I felt the relief slowly settle in, but the fear was still there. Megan didn't say a word, just stared straight ahead. My hands were still shaking, and the silence in the car was unsettling. I tried to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come out. It was as if anything we said might bring back that suffocating feeling we'd experienced in Derek's house. It all seemed so surreal, yet at the same time, I knew it had been very real. After a few minutes on the road, Megan finally broke the silence. "What do you think was in that container?" she asked, her voice low, as if she was afraid of the question itself. I swallowed hard. I don't know, but it wasn't anything good," I replied, my mind still spinning with images of what could have been inside. It was impossible not to imagine the worst. Maybe it was just trash, as she had joked earlier, but deep down, we both knew it was more than that. Something was wrong, something that shouldn't have been seen. My hands were still trembling on the wheel as I tried to focus on the road. I knew I was driving too fast, but all I could think about was getting away. Even with the car miles from that house, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I checked the rearview mirror several times, half expecting to see Derek following us, but the road was empty. Still, the fear lingered, clinging to my skin as if something invisible was coming along with us. When we finally reached my house, I turned off the car and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Megan looked at me, and for a moment, neither of us knew what to say. We went inside without saying a word, but the relief of being in a familiar place wasn't enough to erase the sense of danger. I knew I wouldn't be able to forget what happened that night. Something about that container and that man had shaken me in a way I couldn't explain. We were back at my house, but the unease I'd felt in Derek's house was still with me. After a few minutes of silence, Megan finally spoke up. "That was the weirdest thing that's ever happened, Ash. What do you think was really in that container?" I didn't know how to answer. My brain was exhausted, spinning in circles as I tried to process what we had experienced. The most obvious answer was that it was just some disgusting junk, but something inside me knew it was much more than that. As I was getting ready to tell Tyler what had happened, he arrived home from work. His face lit up when he saw me, but it quickly faded when he noticed the tension in the air. "What happened? Why do you two look so pale?" he asked. Megan and I exchanged glances before explaining everything. The container, Derek, the creepy house, and the horrible smell. Tyler listened intently, not interrupting, but as we went on, I saw disbelief growing in his eyes. He tried to be rational, downplaying what had happened. "It was probably just some weird guys selling cheap junk," he said, trying to reassure us. But still, Tyler was curious. He opened his laptop and tried to find some information on Derek or the house where we had been. To our surprise, he couldn't find any record of that Facebook Marketplace profile. Derek simply didn't exist anymore. He tried to access the listing, but the page was down. "That's odd," Tyler said, more serious now. Not knowing what had really happened intrigued him, and soon he was looking up the address of the house. What he found was even more unsettling. The house we went to belonged to an elderly woman who had lived alone for years. There was no man named Derek living there, and the last anyone had heard about that house was months ago when the old woman had stopped leaving. Derek's profile seemed to be a front, something used to lure unsuspecting buyers. Megan and I sat in silence as Tyler showed us the information. The mystery of who Derek really was and what was in that container became even more disturbing. Days passed after the incident, but the discomfort didn't go away. I couldn't stop thinking about the house, the unbearable smell, and the way Derek had looked at us. And above all, the question that wouldn't leave my mind: what was really in that container? We tried to move on, but that experience seemed to haunt my thoughts, like an echo that refused to disappear. Every time I passed by an old house or saw a suspicious offer online, the fear resurfaced. What had started as a simple plan to impress Tyler had turned into a nightmare I didn't know how to leave behind. To this day, the mystery was never solved. We never found out who Derek was, what he wanted, or what was really in the container. All I know is that after that day, I never looked at Halloween decorations the same way again. The fear lingers, and the feeling that something is watching me never really went away. The scent of dry leaves and carved pumpkins filled the air as I adjusted my pirate costume, eager to head out for trick-or-treating. It was Halloween of 1978, and I, Ethan, at 11 years old, could hardly contain my excitement. I remember the previous year when I ran freely through the neighborhood with my friends, our bags filling with treats at every door we knocked on. The feeling of freedom and adventure from that night still echoed in my mind, making my heart race at the thought of reliving that magical experience. But my excitement quickly turned into disappointment when my mother entered the room, her serious face contrasting with the joy I felt. "Ethan," she began hesitantly, "this year, you can only go out with a group supervised by Mrs. Harrison." Her words dropped like stones in my stomach. The freedom I had been so eager for vanished in an instant, replaced by a sense of confinement that made me question whether Halloween could still be fun. I tried to argue, beg, even bargain, but my mom remained firm. "Things have changed, honey," she explained, her voice gentle but resolute. "It's for your safety." I knew she was right, but it didn't ease my frustration. The neighborhood had changed in the past year, with stories of strangers lurking in the streets and children disappearing in nearby towns. Concern hung in the air like a thick fog, smothering the joy that used to define this time of year. Resigned, I put on my costume and went out to join Mrs. Harrison's group. The other kids were already there, including Tommy, Mrs. Harrison's son, dressed as an astronaut. Everyone seemed excited, but I could sense an underlying tension, a nervousness that wasn't there the year before. Parents exchanged worried glances and whispered last-minute instructions to their kids. "Stick together. Don't talk to strangers. Be back before dark." The warnings echoed like a grim mantra. As we walked through the decorated streets, I noticed we weren't the only supervised group. Everywhere I looked, adults were guiding small bands of costumed children. The sight made me realize just how much things had really changed. The sense of adventure and discovery that I had loved about Halloween the previous year had been replaced by an aura of caution and fear. I wondered if we would ever regain the carefree freedom we once knew on this magical night. Our little troupe of colorful costumes moved through the neighborhood, guided by Mrs. Harrison's steady voice. "Stay together, kids," she repeated every few minutes, her watchful eyes scanning the sidewalks for any sign of danger. I walked a little behind the group, dragging my feet and feeling the weight of disappointment with every step. The lights on the houses blinked cheerfully, and the sound of children's laughter echoed around us. But to me, everything felt dull and distant. I watched the other kids run from door to door, their candy bags bouncing with excitement. Tommy, Mrs. Harrison's son, seemed particularly enthusiastic, his astronaut costume reflecting the streetlights as he bounced from one house to another. I wanted to share his excitement, but Mrs. Harrison's constant vigilance and the presence of adults everywhere reminded me of how much things had changed. I remembered last Halloween, when my friends and I ran freely through the streets, competing to see who could collect the most candy. The adrenaline of the competition, the thrill of exploring unfamiliar corners of the neighborhood, the sense of independence. It all felt like a distant dream now. This year, every move was calculated, every interaction supervised. The magic of Halloween had been replaced by an almost mechanical routine. As the night wore on, my frustration grew. I watched enviously as some older teenagers passed us, laughing and joking with no supervision. They seemed so free, so carefree. I longed for that freedom, for that sense of adventure that was now denied to me. I tried to express my frustration to Tommy, but he was too busy comparing his candy haul with the other kids to pay attention. Mrs. Harrison must have noticed my disappointment because, at some point, she came over and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "I know it's not what you expected, Ethan," she said softly, "but sometimes we have to make changes to keep safe." Her words, though well-meaning, didn't ease my frustration. I nodded politely, but inside, I still longed for the Halloween I knew and loved. We were passing by the neighborhood park when Tommy suddenly stopped and pointed at something in the distance. "Look," he exclaimed, his voice a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Following the direction of his finger, I spotted a solitary figure standing in the middle of the park. It was a boy, not much older than us, wearing a simple costume and a green goblin mask that covered his entire face. He was completely still, like a statue in the darkness. The sight of the lone boy immediately caught everyone's attention. The other kids began whispering among themselves, their voices a mix of fear and fascination. Mrs. Harrison frowned, clearly disturbed by the sight of a child alone on a night like this. "He shouldn't be out here by himself," she muttered, more to herself than to us. Then, raising her voice, she called out to the boy, "Hey there, are you okay? Do you want to join our group?" The silence that followed was deafening. The boy in the green mask didn't move, didn't respond, didn't give any indication that he had heard Mrs. Harrison's call. He remained there, motionless like a shadow, his green mask reflecting faintly under the nearby streetlights. The atmosphere around us shifted instantly. What had been a fun Halloween night had now turned into something eerie and unsettling. The younger kids in the group started to get nervous, some hiding behind Mrs. Harrison, others clutching each other's hands for comfort. Tommy, who had been so excited moments ago, now looked pale and scared. I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense that something was deeply wrong. The green mask on the boy, with its empty eyes and frozen smile, seemed to be watching us with a disturbing intensity. Mrs. Harrison, trying to maintain her composure, called out to the boy again. Her voice trembled slightly as she said, "Please, dear, it's not safe to be alone. Come with us." But again, there was no response. The boy's silence and stillness were more terrifying than any reply he could have given. At that moment, I wished more than anything to be at home, far away from that enigmatic figure that had turned our Halloween night into something out of a nightmare. The oppressive silence was finally broken when the boy in the green mask moved. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost mechanical, as he began to walk toward us. The tension in the air was palpable. I could feel the entire group collectively holding its breath. Mrs. Harrison, trying to stay calm, stepped forward, placing herself protectively between us and the approaching stranger. "Does anyone know this boy?" she asked, quickly glancing at the other adults who had joined our group. There was a series of head shakes and confused murmurs. No one seemed to recognize the masked child, which only deepened the mystery and apprehension. As the boy got closer, I felt a strange sense of familiarity wash over me. There was something about his posture, the way he walked, that seemed oddly familiar. I frowned, trying to make sense of this feeling. It was like I knew him from school, but I couldn't associate the mask with any specific face. The frustration of not being able to place him mixed with a growing sense of unease. I looked at Tommy, hoping to see if he shared my feeling, but he was pale and frightened, his wide eyes fixed on the figure approaching us. The boy in the green mask stopped just a few feet away from us, his presence creating an invisible circle that no one dared cross. Mrs. Harrison, her voice trembling but determined, tried again. "Hello, sweetheart. Are you okay? Are you lost?" Once again, there was no response. The boy's silence was deafening, amplifying the fear that now gripped our group. The younger children clung to each other, while the adults exchanged worried glances. I couldn't take my eyes off the green mask. Its empty eyes seemed to be staring right at me, as if they were looking directly into my soul. The feeling of familiarity persisted, mixed with a growing sense of dread. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and I could feel that we were about to find out what. What happened next was so quick and unexpected that for a moment it felt unreal. In one instant, the boy in the green mask was standing still in front of us, as motionless as a statue. In the next, his hand dove into his candy bag and emerged holding something that gleamed under the faint streetlight. Before anyone could react, he lunged toward one of the younger kids in the group, a girl dressed as a fairy who had been standing slightly apart from the others. The girl's scream pierced the night, shattering the tense silence that had surrounded us. It was as if a switch had been flipped, turning the peaceful Halloween scene into absolute chaos. Kids screamed and ran in all directions, their colorful costumes blurs in the confusion. The adults shouted orders and tried to reach the attacker, but the widespread panic made it hard to understand what was happening. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind struggling to process the surreal scene in front of me. I saw Mrs. Harrison sprinting toward the girl who had been attacked, her face a mask of horror and determination. Other adults were moving to intercept the boy in the green mask, who was now retreating quickly, the knife still in his hand. The glint of the blade in the moonlight was hypnotic, menacing. It was Tommy's scream that finally snapped me out of my shock. "Run, Ethan," he shouted, his voice filled with terror. Without thinking twice, I turned and started running. My feet pounded against the pavement, my heart hammering in my chest. Tears of fear blurred my vision as I ran desperately toward my house. The sounds of screams and chaos faded behind me, but the fear drove me forward. The streets that had once felt so familiar and welcoming now seemed like a frightening maze. Every shadow looked like it hid danger, every sound a potential pursuer. I ran as if my life depended on it, propelled by the pure terror of what I had witnessed. Halloween, which was supposed to be a night of fun and treats, had turned into a real nightmare, and all I wanted was the safety of home, far away from that green mask and the violence it had brought. I ran until I couldn't anymore, my lungs burning and my heart threatening to explode in my chest. When I finally stopped, leaning against a tree to catch my breath, I realized I was only a few houses away from mine. The sound of sirens cut through the night air, and I saw red and blue lights flashing in the distance, near the park. My mind raced, trying to process everything that had happened. Slowly, with my legs still trembling, I began to walk back toward the scene of the attack. Part of me wanted to run home and hide, but curiosity and concern for my friends drove me back. As I got closer, I saw a crowd forming. Worried parents hugged their children, police officers asked questions, and paramedics were attending to someone in an ambulance. At the center of all the commotion, I saw a group of adults surrounding someone. I pushed my way through the crowd, my heart racing with a mix of fear and curiosity. That's when I heard a muffled gasp of surprise. "It's Leroy," someone exclaimed. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Leroy? The boy who had disappeared almost 2 months ago? It couldn't be. But it was. When I finally got a clear view, I saw the frightened and confused face of Leroy, the boy we all thought we'd never see again. The green mask lay on the ground beside him, a sinister reminder of the night's events. Leroy's eyes were wide and full of tears, his body visibly trembling. He looked smaller and frilier than I remembered, as if the last 2 months had drained all the life out of him. Mrs. Harrison was beside him, her arm wrapped protectively around Leroy's shoulders. She was speaking softly to a police officer, but her eyes never left the boy's face. The atmosphere was a strange mix of relief and horror. Yes, Leroy had been found, but the circumstances of his return were so disturbing that no one knew exactly how to react. As I watched the scene, a sense of unreality washed over me. How had our Halloween turned into this? In the days that followed, Leroy's story spread through the town like wildfire. Bits and pieces of information leaked from the police investigation, each detail more disturbing than the last. I overheard the whispered conversations of adults, catching fragments of the story that made my blood run cold. Leroy had been abducted by a man who called himself the Devil. He wasn't alone. There were other masked men involved. The most frightening part, the one that made me wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night, was the reason behind the Halloween attack. Leroy had been forced to wear the green goblin mask and told he could only be freed if he made a human sacrifice. The idea that someone could do this to a child, turn them into a weapon against other innocent kids, was almost beyond comprehension for me. I tried to imagine the terror Leroy must have felt during those 2 months. Trapped in some unknown place, surrounded by masked men, suffering who knows what kind of physical and psychological torture. How could someone survive something like that? And worse, how could anyone be cruel enough to inflict such horror on a child? These questions haunted me, stealing my sleep and turning my dreams into nightmares. The details of Leroy's captivity were murky, but the few that came to light were enough to terrify the entire community. There were whispers of strange rituals, severe punishments, and a constant state of fear and confusion. Leroy had been broken and remade, turned into something we barely recognized. The cheerful, carefree child we once knew was gone, replaced by a frightened and traumatized boy who could barely speak about what he had been through. The impact on our small town was profound and lasting. Parents became even more protective. Children lost much of their innocence, and a sense of distrust spread like a thick fog. Halloween, which had once been a time of joy and fun, now carried a sinister shadow. As I tried to process all of this, one question kept haunting me. If this could happen to Leroy, could it happen to any of us? In the weeks that followed the Halloween incident, the town buzzed with speculation and theories. The police conducted an extensive investigation, questioning Leroy repeatedly and scouring every inch of the area where he had reappeared. However, one crucial detail from that night continued to baffle everyone. The green mask had mysteriously disappeared. I remembered clearly seeing it on the ground next to Leroy that night, but somehow it had vanished without a trace. The detectives in charge of the case believed the mask might hold vital clues. Maybe there were fingerprints from the kidnappers or some kind of mark that could lead to their identification. But no matter how hard they searched, the mask seemed to have evaporated into the night air. This led to all kinds of speculation among the townspeople. Some whispered that one of the kidnappers must have been present that night, mingling with the crowd, and had taken advantage of the chaos to retrieve the incriminating mask. This theory quickly gained traction, fueling the already existing fear in the community. The idea that one of Leroy's captors could have been so close, watching everything unfold, was terrifying. I found myself glancing twice at strangers on the street, wondering if any of them could be the mysterious devil or one of his masked accomplices. The sense of security we once had in our small town seemed to have been irreparably shattered. Parents became even more vigilant, rarely letting their children out of sight. Windows were locked at night, alarm systems were installed, and an unofficial curfew for children was enforced. The atmosphere in town had changed dramatically. Where there had once been a sense of community and trust, there was now a cloud of suspicion and fear. I felt this shift deeply, realizing how much of my own innocence was slipping away with each passing day. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the mystery of the missing mask remained unsolved. It became a sort of local urban legend, a symbol of the evil that had touched our town. For me and many other kids, the green mask became the monster under the bed, the nightmare that haunted us in the dark. Even though it was just an object, we couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere out there, it still existed, waiting to bring more terror to our community. Years passed, and the case of Leroy and the green mask was never fully solved. The town slowly recovered, but it was never quite the same. Halloween, in particular, was never celebrated with the same innocent enthusiasm. As for me, that night in 1978 remained etched in my memory forever, a grim reminder of how childhood innocence can be stolen in an instant, and how some mysteries remain unsolved, haunting us with their terrible possibilities. If someone had told me that a simple hike would change the way I see the world, I probably wouldn't have believed it. But that's exactly what happened. What was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon in the mountains of Asheville turned into something that still gives me chills to this day. I had no idea that trail would lead me to an encounter that defied reality and the certainties I used to hold. It was just another day, or at least that's what I thought. My name is Christopher. I'm 25 years old, and because of my job, I'm temporarily living in Asheville, North Carolina. The city is surrounded by mountains and forests, and when I'm not busy, I spend my free time exploring the trails. Hiking in the mountains gives me a sense of peace that few other things can. Life in Asheville, though temporary, has made me feel more connected to nature, something that helps me unwind from the stress of work. On that day, I decided to hike through DuPont State Forest, one of my favorite trails. The fresh air and the sound of leaves crunching beneath my feet helped clear my mind. I've always enjoyed the feeling of being isolated in nature, away from the noise and distractions of the city. The independence I gained by moving here made me feel free, and these hikes reminded me of that constantly. Everything was peaceful until I saw something unusual in the distance. At first, I thought it was just another person enjoying the trail, but soon I realized something was off. A middle-aged woman was standing there, watching me from afar. I tried not to think much of it and waved politely, but she simply turned and walked slowly into the forest. I found her behavior a bit strange, but I didn't dwell on it. People act differently, I thought, and she might have just been distracted. Still, something about her left me intrigued. As I continued on the trail, the image of the woman wouldn't leave my mind. Something about her presence seemed out of place, as if she didn't belong in that setting. But I tried to push the thought away, refocusing on the tranquility of the hike. It was just another ordinary day, a walk that, until then, hadn't given me any reason for concern. However, I had no idea that this first encounter would only be the beginning of something much larger, something I could never have imagined facing. I kept hiking, trying to concentrate on the soothing sound of the trees swaying in the wind and the fresh smell of vegetation. Yet the image of that woman stuck with me. There was something unsettling about her, something I couldn't explain. I tried to ignore the feeling, telling myself I was probably overreacting. But then, as I climbed a steeper part of the trail, something strange happened again. There she was, the same woman, standing at a considerable distance, watching me again. This time, the feeling of discomfort hit me even harder. The same emotionless stare, fixed on me as if she was waiting for something. The déjà vu was so strong that it made me stop walking for a few seconds, trying to comprehend what was happening. My mind searched for a logical explanation, but there was no reason she should be there again, exactly like before. Fear began to grow inside me. This wasn't normal. How could she have gotten so far ahead on the trail without me seeing her pass? The idea that something was wrong started to take over my thoughts. This time, I couldn't simply brush it off. I looked around, trying to see if anyone else was nearby, but it was just the two of us alone in the forest. The silence around me was unsettling, as if the wind had stopped blowing. She stood there for a few moments, just watching me, and then, just like before, she turned and disappeared into the forest. Her movements were slow and deliberate, but somehow they made me even more uneasy. Something inside me told me not to follow in the same direction. Despite my instincts, I decided to keep going on the trail, maintaining a safe distance from where she had vanished. Every step I took made me feel more anxious. I tried to calm my mind, repeating to myself that this was just a bizarre coincidence. Maybe she was just a lone hiker, like me, but the discomfort wouldn't go away. Something was very wrong, and though I tried to focus on the path ahead, the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me alone. At every bend in the trail, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see her figure again. And the truth is, at that moment, I just wanted the hike to end. As I moved further along the trail, the forest around me seemed denser, and the sound of my footsteps mingled with the rustling of leaves. The image of the woman continued to haunt me. I tried to shake off the sense of impending danger, but something inside me knew that her behavior wasn't normal. I decided then that if I saw her again, I would try to speak with her. I didn't want to carry that unease with me for the rest of the hike. A few more minutes passed, and there she was, the third time, standing further ahead, watching me the same way. This time, though, something was different. She seemed closer, more real, and that scared me. I knew I couldn't just keep ignoring what was happening. I gathered my courage and decided to approach her to ask if she was all right. Maybe she was lost, I thought, trying to find a logical explanation for her constant presence. "Hey, are you okay?" I shouted, trying to sound calm, but her reaction was unexpected. The moment I started walking toward her, the woman turned and, with a speed that didn't make sense for her age, disappeared into the trees. I froze for a second, unable to comprehend what had just happened. She moved too fast, like she wasn't human. A chill ran down my spine, and the fear I had been trying to suppress settled in deeply. My instincts screamed at me not to follow, and that's exactly what I did. I stopped where I was, trying to decide what to do. The forest, which had once brought me peace, now felt threatening. The woman, with her unnatural speed and strange behavior, had turned my peaceful hike into something terrifying. What did she want? Why was she following me? None of these questions had answers, and the only thing I knew was that I didn't want to see her again. Still shaken, I continued on my way, but the sense of danger never left me. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide something. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a strange coincidence, but the fear left no room for rationality. Something about that woman was wrong, and I had the impression that my hike was far from over. The forest seemed endless, and my desire to finish the hike only grew. With each step, I felt further away from the tranquility I usually found on the trails. I decided that once I reached the busier part of the trail, where I knew other hikers often passed, I would talk to someone about what was happening. I needed confirmation, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. It didn't take long before I came across a woman walking a dog coming from the opposite direction. She seemed friendly, and the dog, a playful Labrador, came straight toward me. Her presence gave me a temporary sense of safety. As soon as she got close, I seized the opportunity to share what had been bothering me. "Excuse me, but have you seen another woman on the trail today? A middle-aged lady?" My voice still carried a hint of nervousness. The woman looked at me curiously and smiled slightly, shaking her head. "No, I haven't seen anyone like that," she replied, petting the dog. The relief I had hoped to feel from sharing my story didn't come. I explained the situation, describing the strange woman I had encountered several times. At first, the woman tried to laugh it off, saying that trails are full of odd people. But when I mentioned how she moved, the unnatural speed, and the strange behavior, the woman's expression changed. She was silent for a few seconds before suggesting, hesitantly, that maybe I was tired or stressed. Still, the discomfort in her eyes was clear. We said our goodbyes, and she continued on her way with the dog. I wanted to believe that it was all in my head, that maybe I was overreacting. But the more I thought about the situation, the stronger the feeling that something very real and very wrong was happening. The silence of the forest felt heavier, and I wondered if the woman I had met also sensed the same thing, even if she didn't want to admit it. As the path back to town grew shorter, the unease didn't fade. I couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious woman and what she wanted. What was she doing there? Why was she watching me so intently? And above all, why did I have the feeling that this wouldn't be our last encounter? The trail, which usually gave me a sense of freedom, now felt more like a trap I desperately needed to escape. That night, after returning home, everything seemed to be returning to normal, at least on the surface. I took a hot shower, had a simple dinner, and sat down to watch TV, trying to push the disturbing memories of the hike out of my mind. Logic told me that I needed to move on, that I would probably never see that woman again. But deep down, something still felt wrong. Exhaustion finally caught up with me, and I went to bed, thinking that a good night's sleep would help me put everything behind me. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat. After a nightmare I couldn't clearly remember. My room was completely silent, except for the sound of the fan slowly turning. I tried to catch my breath when suddenly I felt something. The feeling was clear. I wasn't alone in the room. The air around me seemed to shift, growing denser, and a strange chill ran down my spine. I looked around, trying to see if anything was out of place. That's when I saw her. The woman from the trail was standing at the foot of my bed, motionless, watching me with the same fixed gaze as before. My heart raced, and an uncontrollable panic took hold of me. I tried to scream, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. The only thing I could do was stare at her, desperately trying to understand how she had gotten into my apartment. Fear gripped every part of me as I struggled to process what I was seeing. Slowly, the woman turned and left the room, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. I jumped out of bed in a panic, unsure of what to do. I ran to the hallway, but no one was there. I checked the doors and windows, all locked. The terror continued to pulse through me as I tried to understand what had just happened. How could she have gotten in? And worse, how could she have disappeared so quickly? Terrified and without answers, I went back to my room, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep again that night. The silence, which once brought me tranquility, now felt suffocating. The mysterious woman hadn't just followed me home. She had entered my room, turning the initial discomfort into pure fear. Sitting on the bed with the lights on, I realized that what I had experienced on that trail wasn't a coincidence. There was something much deeper and far more frightening going on. The following days were marked by a strange feeling of being watched, as if at any moment I might encounter the woman from the trail again. I woke up in the middle of the night, always with the feeling that something was lurking. No matter how hard I tried to forget what had happened, that night kept replaying in my mind. Nothing seemed to make sense. Then, 2 days later, something even stranger happened. Something that would turn my world upside down. I received an unexpected call from my mother, something that at first seemed routine. She wanted to share some sad news. My Aunt Susan, whom I had never met personally, had recently passed away. My mother explained that Susan was a distant relative and that for various reasons, our families had never had much contact. But what made me freeze in the middle of the conversation was when she mentioned her name. Suddenly, the image of the woman on the trail flooded my mind. I have some old photos of her here, my mom said. I can send them to you if you want to know a bit more about the family. I responded mechanically, saying yes, but my mind was racing. This couldn't be a coincidence. When I received the photo and opened it, a chill ran down my spine. There she was, the woman I had seen on the trail and in my room. It was her, my Aunt Susan, the same woman who was now dead. I felt a wave of shock and disbelief wash over me. How was this possible? I looked at the photo repeatedly, trying to find a rational explanation. The same serious expression, the piercing eyes, the same unsettling presence I had felt in the forest. I was looking at the face of the woman who had haunted me. There was no more doubt. The woman I had seen was my aunt. But how? My mind couldn't process what was happening. It wasn't possible that someone who had passed away was following me on the trail or appearing in my room. The revelation hit me like a punch to the stomach. My first reaction was denial, to think that maybe I was going crazy. Maybe the stress from work or the loneliness in Asheville was affecting me more than I realized. But what I saw in that photo was undeniable. The woman who had been following me on the trail was my aunt, and somehow her death was connected to all of this. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to piece together the puzzle that my life had become. I couldn't understand why she had appeared to me, or why she had watched me like that. What did she want? Most importantly, what did this mean for me? From that moment on, I knew my view of everything around me would never be the same. After the revelation, my mind couldn't stop spinning around one question. Why would my aunt, whom I had never met, follow me here? The more I tried to understand, the more questions arose. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe it was all a coincidence, but deep down, I knew there was something more. This wasn't just a vision or a nightmare. The figure of the woman on the trail, my Aunt Susan, was trying to communicate with me. But what? And why? The following nights were long and filled with disturbing thoughts. The feeling of being watched never left me. As much as I tried to continue my routine, the supernatural experience lingered. I started reflecting on what it all meant on a deeper level. I had always believed in what I could see and touch, but now my understanding of reality seemed suspended. It was as if the world had opened up to something I couldn't explain. I began to question my own beliefs about life and death. I had always thought that when someone died, that was the end. But what if it wasn't? What if there was something more, something I had simply never considered? My aunt's apparition forced me to confront what I didn't understand. Was this a spiritual farewell? Or perhaps a warning? I didn't know, and that terrified me. The fear of the unknown was turning into fascination as I tried to make sense of everything. I spoke with my mother about Susan's death, but didn't mention the visions. She told me that Susan had led a difficult life and that, in the end, she had been very lonely. Could it be that, somehow, she was seeking reconnection with me? The idea that my aunt, whom I barely knew, was reaching out to me after death was frightening. But at the same time, it made me wonder if there was a connection I hadn't realized. Something that transcended time and space. Perhaps her appearance wasn't an act of terror, but one of desperation. Weeks passed, and I never saw the woman on the trail again. Yet, her presence never really left. Now, every time I walk along a trail or sit alone in my apartment, I feel a sort of unsettling peace, as if she is still with me, but in a different way. That experience changed me. I learned that there are things we simply can't understand, but that somehow they are part of our reality. And now, whenever I look at the forest, I don't just see trees. I see a world where what's visible is only a small part of what really exists. As time passed, the memory of the woman on the trail began to blend into the ordinary days of my routine in Asheville. But unlike what I had expected, the feeling of unease never completely went away. My Aunt Susan's face, the one I had never met in person but had somehow found me on that trail, continued to haunt my thoughts. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the supernatural experience I had lived through had changed something inside me, and that was impossible to ignore. Every time I tried to return to normal, the fear and fascination with the experience blended together. Now, every time I walk alone on a trail or wake up in the middle of the night, I feel like there's something more in the air. Maybe it's Susan's spirit, or maybe it's just the deep mark that experience left on me. The strangest thing is that after all the initial disturbance, I no longer feel the same fear. Instead, I feel a sort of respect for what I don't understand. Life in Asheville, once so peaceful, now seemed loaded with hidden meanings. Every trail I walked reminded me of my encounter with my aunt and the deep sense that the world around us is much vaster and more mysterious than we realize. I began to question what is real and what isn't, reflecting on the boundaries between life and death. What if Susan had been visiting me as some kind of farewell, or perhaps as a warning of something bigger that I couldn't yet comprehend? As I continued living my life, the perception of the supernatural became a part of me. It didn't matter anymore whether I would see that figure again on the trail or in my dreams. What mattered was that, somehow, the experience had transformed me. I began to see the world with different eyes, more attuned to small signs, to things that would normally go unnoticed. Maybe Susan's message wasn't clear, but she had shown me that there's more around us than we can explain. And so, even without fully understanding what happened, I accepted that some experiences aren't meant to be understood, just lived. The world is a place full of mysteries, and now I knew, more than ever, that sometimes the answers don't lie in logic, but in the deep feelings we carry. My life moved on, but the memory of the woman on the trail, my aunt, will always stay with me, reminding me that there are things beyond our comprehension and that from time to time, we are invited to glimpse those secrets. If I had known what was about to happen on that Halloween night in 1999, I might have stayed home. But at the time, my friends and I were more focused on our costumes and making the most of what we considered our last Halloween before growing up. I, Luke, along with Jake, Evan, and Brandon, were excited to hit the streets for some trick-or-treating. We all knew we were a bit too old for it, but we wanted to squeeze in one last chance to enjoy the tradition. We dressed up as characters from The Matrix, the big hit of that year, improvising with black clothes and sunglasses. The idea of dressing as Neo and his crew had us even more hyped. We felt invincible, like action heroes ready to take on anything. We were aware that childhood was slipping away, and it filled us with a bittersweet feeling. We laughed, made jokes, and embraced the moment, fully aware that these nights of tricks and treats were soon to be behind us. The air was cold, and the autumn breeze carried the smell of fallen leaves and the distant laughter of other kids roaming the streets. We went door to door in our neighborhood, filling our bags with candy. Every time someone opened the door, we were met with smiles or laughter as we struck our best action poses. For a while, everything felt perfect. We were reliving the best parts of childhood, ignoring the fact that soon we'd be too old for this. But, as it often happens on nights like these, our excitement quickly grew into a desire for more. We had already visited all the houses in our area when Jake suggested a change of plans. "Let's go to the next neighborhood," he said. "I heard they have the best candy." I hesitated. Crossing over to that neighborhood meant passing through an area we always avoided, a part of town known for being dangerous. The bullies from that area had a reputation for causing trouble, and it was said to be their territory. But Jake's enthusiasm was contagious, and the adrenaline rush of trying something new pushed us forward. We were dressed as invincible action heroes, after all. Like characters in our own action movie, we decided to take the risk. With our candy bags weighing heavy in our hands and the night growing colder, we began walking toward the unknown part of town. At that moment, we still felt the thrill of adventure. We laughed, made jokes about how we'd have candy until Christmas. Little did we know that in a short while, that feeling of excitement would be replaced by something entirely different, a fear we would never forget. As we neared the dangerous area, the excitement began to turn into apprehension. The neighborhood looked different from ours. The houses seemed older, some with broken windows and no lights on. The atmosphere was quieter, almost deserted, and it made my stomach twist with unease. Still, we kept walking, trying not to show our fear to one another. Jake, always the bravest, led the way confidently while the rest of us hung back a little. I knew we were entering risky territory. Ever since we were kids, we'd heard stories about the Hand brothers, Kyle and Chad, who ruled that area with a group of bullies. They were known for their cruelty and for terrorizing anyone who dared pass through, especially on Halloween. But that night, I tried to push those thoughts aside. Adrenaline was still running through our veins, and the promise of more candy urged us on. It was like we were in a game, and the prize was just ahead. Even so, as we ventured deeper into the neighborhood, the tension grew. The streets were poorly lit, and the sense that something could go wrong at any moment started to settle in. Brandon, the quietest of the group, whispered that maybe we should turn back, but Jake scoffed at him, saying we were almost there, and it was too late to quit. "Come on, guys. We're the Matrix heroes. Nothing to worry about," he said with a confident grin. But I wasn't so sure anymore. Finally, we turned a corner and found ourselves facing a dimly lit alley that would take us to the other side of the neighborhood. I knew this was the point of no return. If we crossed that alley, we'd officially be in the bullies' territory. I paused for a moment, my heart racing, trying to decide if we should really keep going. But once again, Jake took the lead, and we followed. With each step, the tension mounted. There were no more laughs, just the sound of our feet echoing on the asphalt, louder than usual. We walked a few more yards when suddenly, we heard voices behind us. My heart skipped a beat. Turning around, I saw what I had feared most. Kyle and Chad Hand, along with 3 other boys. They were laughing and whispering to each other, clearly amused by our presence. My blood ran cold, and I knew we were about to face something we weren't prepared for. What had started as an exciting adventure was quickly turning into a nightmare. As the Hand brothers and their friends approached, their laughter echoed through the silent alley, making my skin crawl. Kyle, the older brother and leader, stared at us with a malicious grin. Chad, his younger brother, looked eager to have some fun, his fists clenched and his eyes fixed on our costumes. "Look who decided to stroll through here," Kyle said, his voice dripping with contempt. "What are you supposed to be? Trying to play superheroes, huh?" I tried to stay calm, but I could feel the fear rising in me and my friends. Jake, always the boldest, stepped forward and tried to reason with them. "We're just passing through. We don't want any trouble." But Jake's attitude only provoked them further. Kyle laughed loudly, as if it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. "Passing through? You don't pass through here without paying the price." With that, the other boys started to slowly surround us, blocking any chance of escape. Fear was growing inside me, and I saw the same look on Evan and Brandon's faces. We knew we were trapped. They continued closing in, and the atmosphere grew even more tense. The insults didn't stop. Chad began mocking our costumes, tugging at the lapels of Jake's jacket. "You think this is going to protect you?" He shoved Jake in the chest, almost knocking him over. My heart pounded, and my hands began to sweat. We were outnumbered, and any attempt to defend ourselves could end badly. Should we let them go? One of the boys asked, but Kyle's cruel smile was all the answer we needed. We knew there was no easy way out, and all of us were frozen with fear. You can try to run, Kyle said, but it won't do you much good. His voice was low and menacing, and it was enough to make us understand that if we ran, they'd catch us. Adrenaline pumped through my veins as I tried to think quickly about how to escape the situation. That's when I saw Jake give us a look, a signal that he wanted us to split up and confuse them. Without thinking, we exchanged glances and, in a sudden move, scattered in different directions. Chaos erupted instantly. Shouts and footsteps echoed through the alley as I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, my heart pounding in my chest. At that moment, the only thing that mattered was getting away. But as I heard the bully's shouts behind us, I realized this wasn't going to be an easy escape. I ran as fast as I could, without looking back. The sound of footsteps and yells echoed through the alley as we split up, each running in a different direction. My legs burned with effort, but the fear of being caught kept me going. I knew the bullies were chasing us, and all I could think about was the need to escape. I turned a corner, trying to put as much distance between myself and the group as possible. The terrain was uneven, and with my heart racing, everything around me felt like a trap. Within seconds, I realized I was completely alone. There was no sign of Jake, Evan, or Brandon. The sudden silence made me feel even more vulnerable. The sounds of the bullies were fading, but I knew they were still nearby. I ran a few more yards until I found an empty lot covered in bushes. Without thinking twice, I dove into one of them, hiding in the thick foliage. My chest rose and fell rapidly as I tried to catch my breath. The smell of wet earth filled my lungs as I struggled to calm my breathing, praying that no one would find me. Lying there, my heart still racing, I heard footsteps approaching. I stayed completely still, holding my breath. The footsteps grew louder, and Kyle and Chad's voices echoed between the empty buildings. Where did they go? I heard Kyle ask, his voice filled with frustration. I knew I was in danger, and the fear of being discovered made my body tremble. They sounded closer now, their shadows cast by the moonlight flickering between the branches of the trees and bushes around me. Every second felt like an eternity. I could hear the rustling of leaves as the bullies searched the area. They couldn't have gone far, Chad said, his voice low but filled with malice. I tried to shrink even further into the bushes, praying they wouldn't find me. With each step that came closer, I felt my heart pounding harder in my chest. I was completely at their mercy, with no way to defend myself. Then, with a cold wave of fear running down my spine, I heard one of the boys whisper, "Hey, I think I found one." Panic took over my mind. I knew my hiding spot had been discovered, and the chances of escaping unharmed were dwindling fast. I braced myself for the worst, knowing that at that moment, the only thing that could save me was an unlikely twist. Before I could move, Ferry, one of the bullies who was with the Hand brothers, found me in the bush. He looked me right in the eyes and smiled cruelly. "We found you, idiot," he said, yanking me out of my hiding spot with a brutal force that knocked the wind out of me. I tried to fight back, but he was much stronger. "Look who was hiding," he sneered as he shoved me hard to the ground. I landed on my back, the impact making my head spin. Before I could react, Ferry kicked me in the stomach, forcing all the air out of my lungs. The pain was intense, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. I tried to protect myself, raising my arms to block the blows, but it was useless. Ferry was completely out of control, as if he was enjoying the brutality. "You thought you could run?" he said, laughing between each word. Every sentence was accompanied by a punch or a kick, and I felt my body breaking under the weight of the violence. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. I begged him to stop, but Ferry kept going, relentless. My vision started to blur, and all I could think about was how this might be the end for me. "Please stop," I pleaded, feeling the tears burn in my eyes. But he seemed to feed off my desperation. The world around me seemed to crumble, and all I could think was that my life might end right there, in that dirty alley, with no one knowing. What terrified me the most wasn't just the physical pain, but the complete sense of helplessness. Ferry was cruel, and I knew that if it were up to him, he wouldn't stop. His violence was different from the usual intimidation of bullies. There was something much darker in his eyes, as if he was looking for something beyond just beating me up. Each punch felt heavier, and my body wasn't responding like before. The pain was excruciating, but the fear was even worse. I had no way out. Then, amid all the chaos, I heard Kyle's voice. "Ferry, that's enough." His voice was firm, but with a tone of boredom, as if he was tired of the game. Ferry hesitated for a moment, looked at Kyle, and strangely, stopped hitting me. The relief was immediate, but the pain still throbbed throughout my body. Kyle stepped forward with a disdainful grin and said, "Let him go. This is boring now." Ferry reluctantly stepped back, and I knew at that moment that my life had been spared, but with a scar I would carry forever. Still lying on the ground, groaning in pain, I stayed motionless for a few seconds after Ferry finally stopped the assault. My vision was blurry, and the metallic taste of blood in my mouth was the only thing I could sense. Kyle and Chad stood there, looking down at me with bored expressions, as if the whole thing had just been a game that had lost its fun. The shock of what had just happened prevented me from fully grasping the situation. But one thing was clear: I was alive. Ferry, on the other hand, seemed disappointed with the interruption, his eyes still gleaming with a violent hunger. Kyle let out a dry laugh and said, "Come on, Ferry. He's already beaten. This isn't fun anymore." His voice was cold, and the way he casually decided the beating was over made me feel even smaller. My life had been in their hands the entire time. At that moment, I wasn't in control. My survival had depended entirely on the whims of these guys who treated violence like a sport. Kyle looked at me and, with a casual gesture, said, "You can go. Get out of here," as if he were doing me a favor. I could barely stand up. Every movement was painful, and my arms trembled from exhaustion and fear. I struggled to get to my feet, wobbling as the pain radiated through every part of my body. Ferry continued to watch me from a distance with a disturbing grin, but he didn't make another move. Apparently, the Hand brothers had decided the game was over. I walked away slowly, trying not to draw any more attention than I already had, while the adrenaline gradually left my body, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache. I was free, but in such a humiliating way that it almost made me wish I had never left home that night. As I finally got far enough away, I heard the footsteps of the bullies fade into the silence of the night. The alley grew dark and empty again, as if nothing had happened. But for me, the world had changed. Every step I took toward my neighborhood felt heavier. I knew my friends were out there, trying to escape too, and I just wanted to find them to be sure they were okay. My mind was spinning, struggling to comprehend how I had just been beaten and, somehow, let go without any real reason. On the way back home, I found Jake, Evan, and Brandon, all equally shaken. Their faces told the whole story. They had also faced moments of pure terror, but fortunately, none of them had been beaten like I was. None of us said a word on the way back. We walked in silence, defeated, trying to process what had just happened. It was no longer about candy or being the Matrix heroes. It was about how we had been reminded that the real world was much crueler than any movie. The physical pain I felt that night was intense, but the psychological trauma ran much deeper. When I got home, my body was bruised and cut, but more than that, my mind was shattered. That night, I realized how close I had come to not making it home. It could have been so much worse if Kyle and Chad hadn't decided the game was over. The thought that my life had been completely out of my control that night haunted me every time I closed my eyes. I spent weeks reliving that night in my mind. Ferry's malicious gaze still haunted me. Why was he so violent? And why had Kyle and Chad, known for their cruelty, let me go? I couldn't find an explanation that made sense. Sometimes, I wondered if it had been some kind of warning, a twisted way of showing us that there were lines we shouldn't cross. But deep down, I knew there was no reason. Bullies like them don't need a reason to be violent. The experience scarred me deeply. The laughs and shoves that had once seemed like harmless adventure now carried a different weight. I was no longer the kid who went out at night with his friends, laughing and having fun with candy and costumes. Halloween night in 1999 had taught me just how cruel and unpredictable the world could be. Every sound of footsteps behind me, every poorly lit alley, brought me back to that moment of pure terror. Years later, I found out that Ferry had been killed in a gang fight. When I heard the news, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt relieved to know that someone so violent and cruel was no longer out there, hurting people. But another part of me wondered how his life had reached that point. The cycle of violence that he fed into had consumed him, and I couldn't help but think that had things been different, it could have been me in that situation. Reflecting on it all only deepened the feeling that, though I had survived physically, that night had left emotional scars that would never fully heal. I still remember the fear, the pain, and the helplessness I felt. And while I survived, the trauma of that night continues to haunt me, reminding me that the world is much darker and more dangerous than I had ever wanted to believe. Time passed, but the memories of that Halloween night in 1999 remain vivid in my mind. I can't forget the physical pain or the terror I felt, but what haunts me most is knowing how close I came to something far worse. That night, Ferry could have killed me. His eyes, filled with cruelty, still haunt me in my nightmares. And the feeling of being completely at the mercy of someone else's violence has never really gone away. But what surprised me most over the years was hearing about Ferry's death. When I found out he had been killed in a gang fight, I didn't know what to feel. At first, I felt relief. He wouldn't be a threat to anyone anymore. Ferry, with his uncontrolled anger and brutal attacks, seemed destined for a tragic end. But as the news spread, I began to reflect on his life. Ferry wasn't much older than I was back then, and thinking about how his life was shaped by violence and ended so brutally made me realize the terrible cycle he had been trapped in. I survived, but he didn't have the same luck. What makes me think is that, in a way, I was also a victim of that cycle. That night, the violence that hit me was a reflection of something much bigger, something Ferry probably lived with every day. Growing up in an environment where aggression is the only way to survive changes people. And in the end, Ferry's fate was almost inevitable. I physically escaped that situation, but I always wonder if I was marked in a different way, emotionally. Violence has a strange way of creeping into your life, even when you survive it. Though Ferry is gone, the impact of that night still stays with me. I try not to live in fear, but every time I walk through a poorly lit alley or hear footsteps behind me, I feel the same adrenaline I felt when I ran that night. The world became a more dangerous and uncertain place after that experience. Even though the bullies from back then are no longer part of my life, the scars they left run deep. And those scars taught me that, for some, violence isn't just an isolated moment. It's a constant that shapes their lives. Now, years later, I see everything more clearly. Ferry's death made me realize just how much he was also a victim of something larger than himself. And although I don't feel sympathy for him, I understand that the cycle of violence that destroyed him could have consumed me too. I was lucky. I survived, but the trauma of that Halloween night in 1999 still haunts me. I never celebrated Halloween the same way again. And every year when this time comes around, the memories return, reminding me that violence can be unpredictable and can change lives forever at any moment. Life moved on for me, but the shadow of that night still lingers. Ferry is gone, and from what I've heard, the Hand brothers have also gone their separate ways. But the lesson I learned is that no matter how hard we try to distance ourselves from the past, certain nights, like Halloween in 1999, leave marks that follow us for the rest of our lives. In a town as quiet as Knoxville, boredom is almost inevitable, and Michael and I knew this from an early age. Childhood friends, we grew up together trying to find ways to make life a bit more interesting, even if it meant taking too many risks. Now, at 19, we still shared that thirst for adventure, especially in a town that seemed frozen in time. On a day like any other, Michael suggested something that shook up our routine: exploring the infamous abandoned house at the edge of town. The house, an old structure that seemed swallowed by time, was wrapped in sinister stories. They said the former owners disappeared without a trace, and since then, no one had dared to enter. To us, though, it was just another urban legend. The idea of exploring a place like that, with decades of mystery surrounding it, was exactly the kind of challenge we were looking for. It would be the adventure to break the monotony of our Knoxville life. And Michael was determined to go, even if it meant getting into trouble. We joked about ghosts as we drove toward the house. The sky was starting to cloud over, and the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. As we got closer, the size of the house stood out on the horizon, isolated on land that seemed forgotten by time. "Looks like we'll be the first to check this place out in decades," Michael said with a grin, clearly excited by the idea. The old building seemed inviting in a disturbing way, almost like it had been waiting for us. We parked the car some distance away to avoid drawing attention from passersby or neighbors. The path to the house was overgrown with tall, dry grass, adding to the sense of abandonment. When we finally reached the back entrance, we found the door unlocked, as if the house wanted us to come in. "That can't be a coincidence," I joked, but the truth was that a slight unease began to creep in. Still, we ignored the instinct to turn back and pressed on. Pushing open the door, it creaked loudly, echoing in the house's silence. The air inside was dense and musty, filled with the scent of accumulated dust and old wood. What struck us the most was how everything seemed frozen in place, like the former owners had left in a hurry and never returned. Old furniture covered in dust, paintings on the walls, and personal items scattered around the rooms. It was as if time had stopped here, which only made it all the stranger. Little did we know this was just the first of many unsettling discoveries. We looked around, taking in the details of the house. Every corner seemed to tell a forgotten story, and the fact that everything remained virtually untouched despite years of abandonment left us unnerved. The air felt thick, as if something unseen was pressing us to leave. But at the same time, an insatiable curiosity pushed us to keep going. "Man, it looks like no one's lived here in decades," Michael muttered, running his hand over a dusty armchair. The thick layer of dust was proof that this place had been undisturbed for a long time. We explored the room slowly, feeling the weight of the house on our shoulders. There was a living room with an old clock on the wall, stopped in time. A tea set sat on the table, as if someone had left in a hurry. In the corner, a bookshelf full of old, dust-covered books, some with pages yellowing from age. The feeling that something was out of place began to intensify. Even in the silence that filled the house, it was impossible not to feel like we were being watched, like the walls had eyes. As we walked through the narrow, dark corridors, a strange confusion took over me. The house's structure felt oppressive, as if it were guiding us down paths that led nowhere. Hallways that ended abruptly, doors that seemed meaningless. Everything felt designed to make us lost. Michael and I began to talk less, absorbed by the heavy atmosphere. Then, at the end of a hallway, we found a half-open door that led to a staircase going down into the basement. "Do you want to see what's down there?" Michael asked with a slight nervous smile. I hesitated for a moment, looking at the dimly lit stairs that plunged into darkness. Something inside me screamed not to go, but curiosity won out. Nodding, I took the first step, and he followed right behind me. Each step creaked beneath our feet, and the smell of mold and dampness grew stronger as we descended. The air felt heavier down there, and the darkness almost swallowed us. When we finally reached the basement, it took a few seconds for our eyes to adjust to the faint light coming from candles lit in a corner of the room. Instantly, something was wrong. "Who lit those candles?" I muttered, my voice barely audible in the thick air. In the center of the basement, a rocking chair was moving slightly, as if someone had just gotten up from it. And then Michael froze. "There's someone sitting there," he whispered, his voice trembling, pointing to the chair. My heart raced, and as I looked closer, I saw a pale hand resting on the arm of the chair. For a moment, I was paralyzed. What we were seeing made no sense. Who could be in that house, in that basement, sitting in a rocking chair like they had been waiting for us? My eyes struggled to adjust to the dim candlelight, and I could barely make out the figure sitting there. Fear began to swell inside me, a growing sense of panic that seemed to grip every fiber of my being. "Michael, we need to get out of here," I whispered, but he was fixated on the figure, unable to move. The chair creaked slowly, a sound that filled the oppressive silence. The hand I'd seen on the arm of the chair was still, white and wrinkled, as if it belonged to someone very old. The figure was shrouded in shadows, and the face was indistinguishable, just a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb all the light around it. Michael took a step back, his breathing growing heavier. This can't be happening," he said, his voice barely audible. The fear was tangible, and I knew we had to get out before something worse happened. Without making a sound, I grabbed Michael's arm and started pulling him toward the stairs. He hesitated for a moment, as if hypnotized by the sight, but finally he gave in, and we began moving slowly back upstairs. Each step we climbed felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself was holding us back, trying to keep us there. The sound of the rocking chair continued to echo behind us, and all I could think was that at any moment, that figure would stand up. When we finally reached the ground floor, my heart was racing. The house, which had already been terrifying, now felt even more oppressive. The silence from below had followed us, like an invisible shadow hovering over us. "There's someone here, Samuel," Michael whispered, his face pale with fear. "We need to leave." Whatever was in the basement wasn't something we were prepared to face. Our plans and imaginations no longer mattered. The only thing that mattered now was getting out of that house. We started moving toward the back door, trying to stay quiet, as if the smallest noise might draw whatever was in the basement. My legs were trembling, and the air felt too heavy to breathe. We were almost at the exit when something made my heart stop for a moment. Standing in front of the basement door at the end of the hallway was a figure. The dark, tall silhouette stood motionless, blocking our way. And for the first time, I realized that whatever had been watching us didn't just want to scare us, it wanted to stop us from leaving. Panic took hold of me as I stared at the still figure blocking our path. It was impossible to make out any details, but the dark silhouette felt threatening, as if it was waiting for us. My heart was pounding so fast it felt like it would explode. Michael, beside me, was frozen, his eyes locked on the figure ahead. Neither of us could move or speak. We were trapped in suffocating silence, the fear growing with each passing second. I tried to think of a way out, but my body felt frozen by terror. All I wanted was to get out of there, but the figure's presence kept me from taking any steps forward. The hallway seemed longer than before, and the darkness around the figure made it feel like we were further from the exit than we really were. I looked at Michael, hoping he would say something, anything that could help us get out of this. But he remained silent, fear etched on his face. The tension built with each passing second. The sound of the rocking chair that had once echoed from the basement now seemed distant. But the figure before us was real, tangible, and blocked any attempt at escape. I tried to control my breathing, try not to make any noise, but I knew that at some point, we'd have to act. "We need to run," I whispered to Michael, trying to muster some courage. He looked at me and nodded, but we both knew that if the figure moved, we wouldn't stand a chance. Sweat trickled down my back as we made our decision. We knew the only way out was to get past that figure, and the only way to do that was to run as fast as we could. Fear kept us paralyzed, but it also gave us an adrenaline rush that maybe was our only chance of escape. Deep down, I just wanted it to be over, for us to leave that cursed house and never return. Suddenly, the figure moved, as if inviting us to make our escape. The slight movement snapped me out of my trance, and before I could think twice, I grabbed Michael's arm and started running. He hesitated for a second, but soon we were sprinting down the hallway. The sound of our footsteps echoed through the house, breaking the oppressive silence. My heart was in my throat, and the only thing on my mind was the back door, our only chance to get out. Our feet pounded on the wooden floor as we ran toward the back door. The adrenaline pumping through my body was the only thing keeping me going. The house seemed to close in around us, as if each wall were getting closer, trying to swallow us whole. As we ran, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure moving behind us, but there was no sign of it. That didn't make the situation any less terrifying. In fact, the silence only made the fear worse. It was like we were being hunted by something invisible. When we finally reached the back door, the silhouette was still there, in the distance, standing near the basement. It was watching us, unmoving, which somehow made it even worse. Michael's breathing was heavy, and I knew he was as terrified as I was. But for some reason, the figure didn't follow us. It seemed content to just watch, as if it knew that fear had already consumed us. It made me wonder, did it just want us to leave? I reached for the door handle, and for a moment, I was afraid it wouldn't open, like in one of those nightmares where you can't escape. But to my relief, the door opened easily, creaking softly like before. I didn't wait a second longer. I pushed the door open with all my strength and stepped outside into the cool night air. Michael followed right behind me, and as soon as we were out, the weight that had been pressing down on my shoulders seemed to lift, as if the house had finally let us go, but not without leaving its mark. We ran to the car without looking back. I didn't care to check if the figure was following us. All that mattered was getting away from that place as fast as possible. Our footsteps were hurried and erratic, echoing through the empty yard as the car seemed so far away. My legs felt heavy, but the fear of being caught by something I didn't understand kept me moving. With each step, the distance between us and the house grew, but the fear didn't fade. When we finally reached the car, Michael jumped into the passenger seat without a word, and I slid into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking as I tried to fit the key into the ignition. "Go, go, go," Michael muttered, nervously glancing back at the house, as if something or someone would appear at any moment. I started the car and sped away. Without looking back, my heart still racing. We were safe, but the trauma of that night would stay with us forever. As we drove back to town, the silence between us was overwhelming. Neither of us had the words to describe what had just happened. Michael stared blankly out the window, still catching his breath, and I tried to steady mine as the fear that had consumed us began to fade. The adrenaline coursed through our veins, but we were safe, or at least that's what we tried to convince ourselves. Deep down, I knew something had changed. The abandoned house wasn't just an old, forgotten place. There was something there, something that had been watching us and wanted us gone. "Did you see that?" Michael finally broke the silence, his voice still trembling. "What was that thing, that person?" I didn't know how to respond. I replayed the moment I saw the silhouette for the first time, my body frozen in fear. "I don't know," I answered, my mind still trying to process what we had witnessed. Whatever had been in that house wasn't just a physical presence. There was something dark and unsettling there, something that seemed to have been watching us since the moment we stepped inside. Michael started talking, trying to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a homeless person, someone who had taken refuge in the basement. Maybe it was a coincidence, and fear made us imagine the worst. But as we continued to talk, no explanation seemed to make sense. The lit candles in the basement, the rocking chair moving on its own, the figure standing at the end of the hallway. Everything pointed to something beyond the natural. "It wasn't normal," Michael finally said, and I knew he was right. When we finally got home, the relief of being far from the house didn't lessen the impact of what we had experienced. We had gotten into the car in search of adventure, and instead, we found something that was beyond our understanding. Sitting in the car in silence, we realized the mystery of the abandoned house would remain unsolved. "We're never going back there," Michael said, and I agreed immediately. Whatever that figure had been, we knew we weren't meant to go back and find out more. Even now, with the house far behind us and the danger past, the fear lingered. We knew we had narrowly escaped, but the experience had left its mark. We returned home in silence, without looking back, but with the feeling that, even though we had left the house, it would never leave our minds. That night would become a dark memory, one we would carry for a long time, a mystery that would never be solved. Now, looking back, the experience in that house remains shrouded in mystery. We never found out who or what was there, and maybe we never will. What happened that night was real enough to terrify us deeply, but it also taught us something about the unknown. There are places where time seems to stop, where invisible presences watch in silence. And although we never returned to that house, The impact of what we went through has never left us. What was that figure? Who lit the candles in the basement? Those questions still haunt us, and maybe it's better that way. Some things, perhaps, are better left undiscovered.